Okay, let's get started. So again, good morning. My name is Kate Elkington, and I am one of the Grand Rounds co-directors, along with Drs. Christine Denny and Jeff Miller. So we just have a few announcements before we begin with today's presentation. Next week, there will be no Grand Rounds due to the APA annual meeting in San Francisco, but rounds will resume the following week, May 31st, with an in-person lecture from Dr. Lisa Monteggia, who is the professor of pharmacology and the Barlow family director of the Vanderbilt Brain Institute, Vanderbilt School of Medicine. And the title of Dr. Monteggia's talk will be Mechanisms of Rapid Antidepressant Action. This will be an in-person lecture, following the lecture, a lunch will be served in the first floor atrium outside the auditorium for all in-person attendees. And before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to remind and encourage everyone to post questions at any time during the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, not the chat. If you are a trainee, as usual, we ask you to please mark trainee at the end or beginning of your question, and so we will prioritize questions from you all. Also, after you've entered a question, if you would write whether or not you can ask the question yourself or you prefer to have your question read, that would be great. And if you are willing to ask the question yourself, we will temporarily promote you to the panelist so that you can then turn on your camera and speak directly to our guest today. And we encourage you to ask questions live, so to speak, as we believe it adds to our sense of connection during these Zoom sessions. Okay, so let's turn to today. Today's Grand Rounds is given by Professor Meyer-Lindenberg, who is the director of the Clinical Institute of Mental Health, as well as the medical director of the Department of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the Institute, based in Mannheim, Germany, and a professor and chairman of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the University of Heidelberg in Heidelberg, Germany. He is board certified in psychiatry, psychotherapy, and neurology. And before coming to Mannheim in 2007, he completed his medical training and residency in Germany before spending 10 years as a scientist at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda. His research interests focus on the development of novel treatments for severe psychiatric disorders, especially schizophrenia, through an application of multimodal neuroimaging, genetics, and environments to characterize brain circuits underlying the risk for mental illness and cognitive dysfunction. Dr. Meyer-Lindenberg is the author of more than 480 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and is continuously named as one of the most highly cited scientists in the world. He is the editor-in-chief of the new Journal of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, which is called Neuroscience Applied, as well as the associate editor of Science Advances, and on the editorial board of a number of other journals. In recognition of his research, Professor Meyer-Lindenberg has received awards throughout his career, including the Joel Elks International Award for Clinical Research from the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology and the A.E. Bennett Award from the Society of Biological Psychiatry, to name but a many number of awards. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Meyer-Lindenberg. The title of his talk today is Environmental Risk and Resilience Mechanisms for Psychiatric Disorders. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Meyer-Lindenberg. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be with you, if virtually, and talk about a topic that has interested us for a number of years now, which is to look at the environment with regard to the risk and resilience for psychiatric disorders. That is a research approach that is primarily motivated by the need to do precision psychiatry. If you look at the slide, I guess many of you will have seen a variant of this. The intuition that this slide is trying to convey is that our categorical diagnoses, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, aren't precise enough to map the necessary understanding of subgroups to support stratification that we need in order to assign homogeneous groups to the treatments and prevention approaches that they need. So that's what these colors are meant to convey. And this intuition, I guess, that many people in the field now share, is that we need to supplement categorical diagnoses by an understanding of underlying mechanisms. has by and large in biological psychiatry been started by looking at genetic variation. And in our own work, this has also been true. We've started looking at the genetic variation impacts, for example, on brain structure and function. But it is obviously true that in addition to genes, the environment plays a significant role in risk for the manifestation of mental disorders, as shown here in the example of depression, but you could have similar slides, similar graphics for the majority of large psychiatric disorders. So, of course, we have biological mechanisms shown here in the center, but then you have environmental factors really ranging from physical factors such as noise or lead or air pollution to the proximate social context, your work, your family, your friends, but also distant social contexts such as being born in a city, climate change, economic aspects, unequal distribution of resources, these kinds of things. And just as we now have evidence from large studies that is reliable that genetic factors are causal for increasing the risk for mental illness. So it is true that for practically everything you see on the slide, there is causal evidence from epidemiological studies. But in both cases, you still have to ask the question, how does this work? So what are the mechanisms by which environmental exposure such as air pollution impacts the risk for mental illness? And this is something we've been interested in for a while. And what I would like to do is show you two examples. First, on the risk side of this approach, we're going to look at two established risk factors and ask how do they work neurobiologically, and then I'm going to flip it around and ask the same question about environmental resilience. What in the environment can increase our resistance to mental illness, increase our resilience? And on the risk side, the first example that I'd like to discuss with you, and also historically, the first one that we've become very interested in, continue to be interested in, is being born into and living in a city. It's also called urbanicity. That is a long line of research going back to this classic paper by Ferris and Dunham in Chicago, looking at Chicago in the early 30s and finding that as you get into the inner cities, you find more and more people with mental illness. Finding that at the time was primarily interpreted from sociological perspectives, things like, maybe people with mental illness prefer to live in the city, or they can't afford a car and can't move in the suburb, drift hypotheses like this. But this was subsequently replicated over and over again. And by epidemiological evidence, we now have to assume that urbanicity, through mechanisms we have to define, is a causal risk factor for mental illness that cannot be explained away by other factors correlated with urbanicity. This is actually relevant for my own place of work, because the first replication of Ferris and Dunham in Europe was this paper from 1965, and this is the city of Mannheim, from which I now speaking to you, and the colors are kind of corresponding. So the dark spot here in the middle of Mannheim, this is the Mannheim inner city, and this is where my institute is, because it was founded as a model institute for community psychiatry. It was put where people with mental illness live. So this finding has been found on all continents, really cities of all sizes, and people have, of course, wondered for decades about the mechanisms, and one inkling of what might be wrong is if you see data like this. This is US data, but this is again shown everywhere, which show a dose response curve between the size of the urban environment you live in and how unhappy you are, right? This is showing happiness or well-being on the y-axis, and the bigger the urban environment you're in, the more unhappy you are. And this lets many people suspect that part of what makes cities bad for mental health is the social environment, that there's subtle forms of social stress because there are many people you meet that you don't know, where they don't care about you, as opposed to the country where this is not the case. So a while ago, we did an experiment using an established social stress paradigm in fMRI to look at this. So if you use fMRI and a paradigm like this allows you to define the brain areas which you see here that are differentially active during social stress, the social stress network, if you will. And there are many such brain areas, of course. And we then asked, are there any areas in the social stress network that are reactive to whose activity is related to the size of the city that people live in? And from epidemiological evidence, we know that the size of the current urban environment is especially linked to depression and anxiety disorders, and that the size of the city you were born into and brought up in early childhood is especially linked to schizophrenia, which triples if you're comparing people born in rural areas and people in the countryside. So two simple questions, two relatively straightforward answers. The one brain area whose activity during social stress specifically was linked to the size of the current urban habitation was amygdala. You see here, you can see that it doesn't really differentially activate if people live in rural areas, a little bit if they live in small towns, and very much so if they live in a large city. The lower line shows you an independent replication that we did in the original paper, and this has now been found in the literature several times. Now, this, of course, makes sense because amygdala hyperreactivity is on the final common pathway for depression and anxiety disorders, because amygdala, if you will, is a danger sensor triggering the fight or flight response. So finding it hyperreactive in the setting fits the epidemiological observations of people living in big cities, suggesting that this might be the mechanism. Similarly, for urban upbringing, so being born into and brought up in the city, we found this brain area. This is part of the cingulate cortex. We call it perigenio-cingulate cortex. And again, we replicated this in the original study independently and since been replicated several times. And this is an interesting brain area, not only because it is affected very early in schizophrenia, which it is, but also because it regulates the amygdala. So there's an actually very simple, in rodents, in fact, monosynaptic, partly feedback circuit in which perigenio-cingulate cortex inhibits amygdala, puts a damper on the danger sensor, if you will. And when I was still at NIMH in Danny Weinberger's lab, at that time, long past now, it was still okay to look at candidate gene variations. And we were looking at a range of candidate genes in the serotonergic system that showed gene-environment interaction, and these variations in brain disrupted the connectivity of that circuit. So we've come to think of this as a circuit for gene-environment interaction. That makes sense because one of the core functions of that circuit is extinction, which becomes important if you have negative affective memories. And so it's interesting to see this pop up in this environmental risk factor of urbanicity and urban living. Now, what does that mean? In order to come closer to that, I would like to contrast it to another risk factor. But before I do it, I have to give you people in Columbia University living in a very large city another bit of bad news. What I've shown you before is brain function. And we also found a bunch of labs have since replicated that there's also an enduring impact of urban birth on brain structure, which reduces gray matter volume in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, shown here, and then also in the same area in the cingulate cortex that it was also affected in function, with a predominance in men, often a sign of a risk exposure being effective already in utero, where male fetuses are more vulnerable. So urban birth impacts both brain structure and brain function. Now, as I said, I would like to contrast that with another risk factor, the second highest known risk factor for schizophrenia in the environment is migration. If you are a first-generation migrant, and if you are the child of a first-generation migrant, second-generation migrant, your risk for schizophrenia doesn't quite triple, but it comes close. It goes up by like 270, 280, 290%. Again, this has been found around the world in a range of constellations of countries, ethnicities, and migration flows. So this is the second biggest risk factor. And from a, if you will, sociological, psychological point of view, we probably argue for quite a while what's similar and what's different between urbanicity and migration, but neuroscience offers a director approach, because you can just look in the brain and ask, is the impact of these two risk factors on brain very similar, or is it very different? And in both cases, I think you've learned something about the underlying mechanism. So we took migration and we did a study on migrants. I should probably mention that while we currently do a lot of work on refugees, currently the Ukrainian refugee situation, before refugees, especially from Syria and Afghanistan, the migration effect is not related to bad things happening to you in the country you're fleeing from or during flight, during migration, because second-generation migrants have never experienced any of these things. This is related to the post-migratory phase. It's related to living in a country with social structures different from the one you were born into, or by which your family, in the case of second-generation migrants, is still characterized. So that said, we did a study in migrants using a very similar, but not exactly the same social stress task. We had to control for a bunch of ethnic and in-group, out-group effects here. So if you will, have a migrant and a native German experimenter team taking care of all of those confounds. And having taken care of those confounds, the effect on stress processing of being a migrant is exactly the same as the one as being born in a city. It is really literally the same spot in brain that is affected in social stress processing by being a migrant. And just as in urbanicity, we could also find an effect on the circuits and on subcortical brain areas that are regulated by the cingulate, the amygdala that I've highlighted before, but interestingly also the ventral striatum. That's interesting because just as you can think of the amygdala hyperreactive as the final common pathway for depression and anxiety disorders, you can think of chaotically increased dopamine release into striatum as the final common pathway for psychosis. So these data suggest that migrants during social stress should have an increased release of dopamine into striatum. And we were fortunate to be able to team up with a number of teams in the US and Canada and in the UK who had PET machines, and we could show this. So you can see that even non-immigrants using the same stress test that I've shown you in the urbanicity task do release dopamine during stress, as we already know at the time, but I guess you can also appreciate that migrants release much more. In fact, almost, depending on the brain area, 3 times as much. So that this hypothesis makes sense, that the dysregulation by cingulate extends to dopamine release into the striatum. And just as in the case of urban birth, you have a very, very similar effects on brain structure. You have this male predominant reduction of gray matter in medial prefrontal cortex / cingulate. So this really looked very similar between these two risk factors. And that is part of a larger story that I don't want to tell you in more detail, though, that we and others have looked at a range of other risk factors. And we've also looked, as I mentioned, at a range of genome-wide significant and candidate, both common and rare genetic variants. And that circuit is often implicated. So we come to think of it as a convergent circuit of risk centered around this part of the cingulate cortex shown here in blue, subcortical brain areas that are regulated by it. And I've been talking to you about ventral striatum and amygdala, and I haven't talked to you about that much, but it's also clear in the data. More evolutionarily younger brain areas in anterior, medial, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that regulate the cingulate in turn. So we have risk circuit neurobiology, if you will. And with that, let me switch to the second half of what I would like to show you, which is the question, can we use this to understand resilience? Can we use this for, if you will, primary, ideally, prevention of these very common and severe disorders? And I'm going to take the urban living environment as my continuing topic, because it's kind of where we think about this most, is where most of the people with mental illness live. And it's also a relatively pressing problem because, as you probably know, mankind is rapidly urbanizing. So it's only like a decade ago that mankind crossed the threshold where more people live in big cities than the countryside. And this is proceeding so rapidly, especially in Asia and especially here in China, that by 2050 it's probably going to be 2/3 of the world population at the very least. If you consider what I told you about the risk increase, it would be good if we could do something about this. If you want to do this, you have to become more detailed about the urban environment. And so for a while, we've been running a study that follows epidemiologically valid cohorts in such an environment longitudinally in order to figure out what precisely is going on around them. We use as our mainstay technology ecological momentary assessment that many of you, I presume, are very familiar with, which these days is largely done using a smartphone on which you can contact people a couple of times during the day and ask them how they feel, what their well-being is like, whether they feel energetic, whether they feel tense, a little bit about the context in which they're in. And then we try to find out as much about the locational context, the environmental context in which this data point was derived as we can. For example, we have location tracking, so we know where in the city this data point was collected. Then we can bring in information from maps. So for example, we have higher resolution maps of green space from satellites. We have maps about the socioeconomic environment from the authorities. We have things that we can measure. Modern smartphone has many, many sensors, over 60, so we can measure movement, we can measure noise, we can measure light, we can measure electromagnetic fields, that kind of stuff. And then doing this in a large number of people longitudinally, you start to see a map of people's well-being over the environment in urban rural context, and then can try to link it to risk and resilience factors that you find through this context analysis. And I'm going to try and show you 3 recent findings from this approach that we've had, 2 somewhat cursorily, and then I'll take a deeper dive into the 3rd resilience factor. Now, the first obvious resilience factor that you would assume to be operational if you buy into this idea that cities are bad to you because they're areas of social stress is that your well-being should be increased if you are with someone that you know versus when you're alone in the city. And this is in fact true. So no shocking surprise there. You will see these kinds of graphs repeatedly through my talk. This is a multi-level analysis in which always on the y-axis you have well-being or affective valence from 0 to 100, 100 being the best. And this is a multi-level analysis, so each of those lines represents one person. And what's contrasted here is being alone versus being in company. And you can see that the vast majority, everyone's shown in gray here, has an upward sloping line. They feel better when they're in company. And so you have a highly significant median effect of this shown in blue. And none of this, I guess, is very surprising. What this technology gives you, though, which you can't get by introspection, is that the effect is very different between people. Practically everyone feels a little better, but some feel a lot better and some hardly react to this at all. We call this difference in well-being a social benefit. And this is something that we can now measure using ecological momentary assessment and map onto the brain. And when you do this, when you map individual social benefit, you can see that it explains variance in brain structure in that area of the cingulate that I'd shown you, and actually quite substantially. Those of you who do imaging, I think, can appreciate that that's a very large effect, much bigger than what you get with other social phenotype, and the directionality is also what you would expect. So it looks like social gain is a resilience factor operating on the same circuit. And we could also show in the paper that it is in fact linked to personality features such as gregariousness and skills such as social expertise, the size of the social network that underpin this impression. This is, I guess, more or less a proof of principle if you believe the basic theory about urban risk. And if we have the setup picking up something useful, it should have detected this facet of resilience. So it is pleasing to see that it did. Second example, something that is, I think, of increasing interest to many of us, the role of exercise and movement in mental health. I guess we all appreciate that exercise is important, not just for somatic, but also for psychological health. And a bunch of us do studies trying to put exercise into treatment regimes. So, for example, we do these studies in schizophrenia, but they're done in a range of disorders. Most of those studies concern exercise, strenuous exercise on a treadmill or on an exercise bike, something like this. The majority of the movement that we do during the day, however, is usually not like that. It's going around your day, moving from one room to the next, commuting, what the sports community calls non-exercise activity. And that's something that we can measure very well using the methodology that I've described to you. And we also add some more sensors while we do this experiment to make this even better. And there had been a paper shortly before we published this paper here by Kathleen Mary Kangas, in which she used this approach in people with affective disorders and showed that in them and also in normals, there was a positive feedback loop, a virtuous feedback loop, in which the more you move in the sense of non-exercise activity, the better you feel, especially concerning one component of well-being that's called feeling energized. And the virtuous circle arises because the more you move, the more you feel energized, the more you feel energized, the more you move. So that works bidirectionally. And that's what differentiates it from sports, from strenuous exercise, because you also feel better after that, but you don't go to the gym right again. You do the opposite. You sort of, sit on the couch and move less. So this virtuous circle aspect is only there for non-exercise activity. And in this paper, we could replicate this using EMA in the urban environment, map it onto the brain. And again, this maps on the cingulate cortex. You see this here on the top left, but if you know your cingulate, you can appreciate that's a different part of the cingulate cortex that is subgenual cingulate. And subgenual cingulate volume is strongly implicated in mood disorders. So if you have a smaller subgenual cingulate cortex, you're more likely to have a depressive episode. You are less likely to respond to treatment well, and that applies to all mainstay treatments. It's been shown for SSRI, it's been shown for CBT, it's been shown for ECT, it's been shown for deep brain stimulation. All of these modalities, smaller subgenual cingulate cortex predicts a worse response and course. So it's interesting to see whether we find a link between this biomarker linked to this environmental resilience exposure and depression. And in fact, it's interesting and something that you find with a range of these resilience factors. So if you look at this graph down here, again, you have well-being, the specific subform feeling energized on the y-axis, and you have how much you move now on the y-axis, and you see the risk group, the one with the small subgenuine cingulate cortex in the non-dashed line, and the non-risk group in the dashed line. And I guess you can appreciate that the line for the risk group is much steeper, which means that if they move less than the population average, they take a much bigger hit in affect. And because of what I told you about the underlying feedback circuit, that means that it now runs in reverse, and so they will move a lot less, which may make them take an even bigger hit in affect. So as they slide down this slope, we think this is a plausible account of what happens early in a depressive episode when your drive goes down, you become apathetic, and reaching a state in which many people do very little of anything at all. So that makes sense to us. And what's interesting then is that on the other end of the spectrum, the line doesn't stop at the median or the mean. It continues to go on, and that suggests that if you are able to get people into movement that have this risk biomarker, they may benefit even more than the normal population. So this would argue, and this is actually something that we're trying to put incentives for, and furthering of non-exercise activity in the treatment algorithm, especially for treatment-resistant groups, because, you know, as I've told you before, that constellation with a small subgenuine cingulate cortex would predict such a worse or even non-response. So those are two, if you will, examples I would like to show you a little bit more cursorily. And now I would like to take a little deeper dive. It is generally true. I've shown you a slide about convergence in risk between genetics and environmental risk factors. We've done a similar narrative review for resilience factors. And here you can also see that there are, of course, specific brain areas that are related, for example, to being optimistic or to having a family with a lot of financial resources. But there's also a convergence area again. And it is striking that the perigenuine cingulate cortex, shown here as PACC, is in that convergence zone. So both in the risk and in the resilience circuit, this brain area seems to be implicated, however, in an opposite directionality as you would expect for risk and resilience factors. So that is interesting, and you start to think about whether there might be underlying, maybe even evolutionary reasons for that circuit being so reactive to the environment. And one topic in which much of our thinking about this has congealed and been organized around, that I would like to talk to you now, is nature. So if you think about the urban-rural divide very broadly, you know, you could be forgiven for thinking as rural circumstances having a bigger dose of nature, and in urban, the opposite, being easier or less easy to access nature. And most of us are probably intuitively attuned to the idea that being in nature is good for your mental health, and that is, of course, also not a new idea that goes back centuries. So it's kind of surprising that it took a while for this to be taken up in neurobiology of humans. So this is, I think, the first paper that showed this clearly by Greg Bradman, who was then a graduate student at Stanford. And you know, I had the pleasure to co-supervise this PhD thesis, and what he ended up doing was to send people either on a walk into Palo Alto or into a nature area close by, and he used a methodology called arterial spin labeling, which is very nice in doing before and after things, because it kind of has a defined zero. To look at the neural effect and also measure cognition, well-being, a bunch of other things. And he found that people returning from the nature walk felt better, their well-being was higher, they were also cognitively better, quite considerably actually. And this was mediated, so the interaction was between before and after and urban and rural was clearly here in the perigenial cingulate cortex again. It's a completely different modality. So this is a very consistent finding that you can see here again in this analysis. And what he also showed, which I think is very interesting, is that that effect could be statistically explained. It was mediated by reduction in rumination. And it is true that nature blocks rumination quite efficiently, about as efficiently as mindfulness actually, and therefore contributes to emotion regulation. There was linked to that differential effect in perigenial cingulate cortex, so adding to the evidence that I've already shown you. Now, this is a controlled experiment. How does this look in people going about their day in the natural environment? This is where our approach comes in again. So this is a study which we did, in which we measured green space using satellite imaging, very high resolution. You can do this. And again, you've seen this several times now. You can see on the y-axis well-being, and on the x-axis, you don't see being alone with others or how much people moved. This is looking at how much green space people encountered, relatively speaking, during their study time, which is a week. And I think, again, you can appreciate that practically everyone's line slopes up. So people benefit effectively from encountering green space. And when I say encounter, what I mean, based on the analysis that we did, this is clearly visual. This is something that people see often from the corner of their eye, a tree or park that they pass by. This isn't being in a park all the time. So this is primarily a visual effect, and the extent of that effect is actually quite considerable. So if you compare the affective state of being in a situation of 100% green space, it would be like in a park or in a nature preserve, and 0% green space, places with 0% green space are fortunately pretty rare, but there are some. So for example, those of you maybe know Paris is a place called La Défense, where there's absolutely no green space. If you are in a situation like that, the difference in well-being between these two extremes is higher than the difference in well-being that you find in any other exposure that we can measure other than currently having sex. So if you are currently having sex, then your well-being goes up more. But for example, having dinner with your spouse or playing with your children, things like that have a lower effect. So that's quite a considerable effect on our well-being that we're completely unaware of. That runs in the background, if you will. And now we can bring neuroscience back into the conversation and try to see, just as I've shown you before, what explains the inter-individual difference in this effect. It's very consistent in the sense that everyone pretty much has it, but it's very different in the sense that some have it a lot and some have it very little. So we did that, and what we found was that people who strongly benefit from nature are people who are impaired in regulating negative emotion intrinsically. So this is a standard paradigm, that we adapted from paradigm by Martari that many people in the field are using, which is show angry and fearful faces. This activates the amygdala, and then the circuit that I've shown you brings the amygdala back down. And people in which this doesn't work are the ones that benefit most from green space, which suggests to us that the environmental risk factor is important to them because it provides a function in the regulation of negative emotion that they have difficulty producing by themselves. Now, that would suggest that this is a risk group, right? If they're deficient in emotion regulation. So we looked at that and we confirmed that. So this is a group of people who are at a higher risk for mental illness, live in areas of the city where this is true. They have a personality and dimensional trait-like characteristics that are related to increased risk, such as increased neuroticism, harm avoidance. They are poorer. So they are clearly a risk population. And now one nice thing that we can do using this combination of neuroscience and geography, as you will, you can ask the question, where in the city do you encounter them? And I don't know if you still remember, I showed you this, what's shown here in the Nature Neuroscience panel graph on the lower left. This was the study done in my city of Mannheim in 1965, and of mental illness incidence, prevalence, I should say. And besides that, you can see our current data set, which was derived from satellites and ecological momentary assessment and neural networks and all that stuff, looking very similar, however. So, you know, it's not a giant difference in where a mental illness risk is concentrated in Mannheim, even now in the inner city. And now, if you ask where do you find the risk population, you find them clearly here in the inner city, where, and this is where sort of the circle closes, there are the least trees, right? So the ones who need it the most get it the least. So if I could plant 10,000 trees in Mannheim, I would put them from the point of view of increasing resilience to the urbanicity risk for mental health right there in the inner city. Can I plant 10,000 trees in Mannheim? Of course not, right? This is not how city planning works. However, this is a current question where new cities are being built at a rapid clip. So this is a question, for example, in China, where these megacities are being built and where input is valued on how to distribute scarce resources such as green space. So in order to get a handle on this, we work with architects. This is the group of Daniela Fischer-Gewürzmann at the Technion in Haifa, who give us architectural models of buildings, but also of entire cities and city blocks. And we have a neat setup of walkable VR. This is our VR lab. And there's this neat thing where you can basically hang a person into this hoop and give her shoes of low friction. And with that, you can walk around in VR as much as you want, for hours, for many miles. If you want, this allows us to study the effects of differently distributed green space. You know, what about if we have a park? What if we put a tree in every corner? What about orange trees? What about vertical greening? Lots of interesting questions about the optimal distribution of green space from the resilience point of view in the urban environment. Can we do something in a situation in which we can't plant 10,000 trees? So Mannheim, or maybe, I don't know, maybe this is also true of New York City. We hope so. We are currently in the early phases of a small clinical trial using this app that you seen here, that we've created with colleagues from the GI Science Institute. This is one of those apps that you probably know, in which you give a starting point and end point, and it spits out an optimal route through the city. This is meant for urban navigation, and this is primarily geared to people who walk or take the bike. And this is nothing new, of course. You have that on your phone already. But the twist to this is that in addition to this, this app spits out a route that you see here, which also goes from the same A to the same B, but it devises a route that maximally uses the nature resources that you do have in the city. So it's trying to, you know, go around a lake or use a road that has a lot of trees lining it. So we hope that strategies such as this, which allows you to use the resources more that you do have in an urban environment, will be helpful in order to increase resilience, even if you can't just turn the city upside down, which you often can't. Now, we find it intriguing that nature has such a big impact. And this suggests, and I already alluded to that before, that maybe people are wired to react like this to nature. And this is, of course, also not a new idea. It's called the biophilia hypothesis. Here are two famous foundational books about this. And the idea is that, you know, if mankind has evolved in a rural environment, if you will, people should prefer the kind of natural contexts that were conducive to their survival or to our survival as a species. And like every evolutionary hypothesis, kind of difficult to prove or disprove, but it is hypothesis generating. And fortunately, we know very well what the environment looked like when our species arose. As you probably know, we can now pinpoint this through mitochondrial DNA mapping and similar things pretty precisely to southern Botswana, right? That's basically where humankind comes from. And we also know what it looked like when we arose as a species. It looked like this here on the lower right was the savanna, right? So in the savanna, and that's also, I think, pretty clear from data from behavioral ecology, where you would like to be is under a group of trees near some water, in the shade, be able to hide from predators with a food supply. And you do not want to be out there in the open, in the middle of this big green areas, very visible. So is that in any way similar to the kind of nature that humans prefer? The answer to that is, we think, yes. This is a really neat set of studies that a group of British scientists have done, who run a website called Scenic or Not, in which you can upload pictures, and then in a gamified format, people vote these pictures for how beautiful, how scenic they think they are. So you have geolocated pictures and you have very good data on how attractive these environments are. And they have trained and published a really neat convolutional, in this case, neural network that you can then use to pull out tons of features from those pictures and relate them to scenicity in this group. And you see this down here. And as I guess you would expect, there's a very strong link between the features of nature that I've just described to you and what people find very scenic, right? And if you look on the right, this is looking at London, and up there on the top, you see the most scenic areas in London. You can appreciate most of them look like the kind of nature that I've described to you, not all of them. So famous architectural landmarks like Big Ben here in Parliament are also seen as very scenic. And you can also appreciate, if you look at the bottom, those are the least scenic, the most aversive pictures, that there's also some green in there, but this is now the wide open space with no place to hide, right? So that actually, we think, really very nicely fits this evolutionary idea. And as a neurobiologist, when you think about this then poses the next question: shouldn't there be a brain mechanism to preferentially process natural stimuli? And so this is a surprisingly open question. There's a few papers out there, but to our thinking, that question hasn't been clinched. And so we have, in the process of doing a bunch of study using fMRI and also using MEG to look at the time course. And this is not through peer review yet, so early days, but pretty much what we currently think is that we can identify a brain area that reference very rapidly and preferentially to nature stimuli of that kind and prefers them to the built environment. This is in retrosplenial cortex, which is interesting because that has strong bilateral correlation to both paragenital cingulate cortex and amygdala, and might therefore be a good brain area that has quick access to visual processing and then feeds into that kind of emotional processing circuit that I've described to you. But again, early days, but we do think this is intriguing. And if this is so, if we are hardwired to regulate our emotions in an environment that we also evolved in, this poses interesting questions for how resilience will be in the future. Because, we've had an interesting millennium so far. I like this cartoon because, of COVID there, but, COVID, of course, is followed by a recession. We would probably now write inflation, maybe social inequality, and the very big challenge that obviously awaits us this century is climate change. And crisis is always very interesting for research, right? So we can try and validate whether what I've shown you about resilient circumstances is actually predictive, if we can verify it, if a crisis is good enough to give us a temporarily defined stress situation. And like many, I guess we're currently looking at that with a rich data set that we got from the COVID pandemic. And I just want to show you one example here. So this is the German experience. Yours obviously was very different, but for us, we had a first nationwide lockdown in the spring of 2020. Right? This is when everything was locked down, schools were closed, and a very stringent form of social isolation was imposed. And then the summer cases went down, the restrictions were removed and completely lifted. People could have a kind of a normal summer, actually, and then cases rose rapidly in the fall again, and we had a second lockdown, nationwide lockdown, in the fall and winter of 2020. And we, as I've mentioned, we are following a lot of people longitudinally, and so we tested them during the first lockdown in the summer and in the second lockdown, and asked the question whether the resilient circuits that I have described to you predict their well-being. And so we looked at the regulation of negative emotion. And I haven't talked about this much, but this is another factor that, of course, we're very interested in, is executive cognition. So this is a standard cognition task that we are doing. And what we found, and to our view, it confirms this idea that we had, is that both during the first and the second social isolation threat condition, well-being was exclusively predicted by emotion regulation. The better you were at that, the more your well-being suffered in the lockdown. And that correlation went completely away during the summer. And what predicted well-being then was cognitive control, which also makes sense because that was what you needed to do at that time to essentially put your life back together again. So at least for the pandemic, in our hands, and we've published a bunch of papers on this now, it does seem to be that the resilience circuit that we are highlighting by looking at people in their natural environment are actually predictive of how they react in concrete defined stressors. Now, that's the pandemic, but let me close with a few remarks on what I think is the bigger problem, climate change. Climate change will deterministically make a bunch of the risk factors that I've talked to you about much worse, right? So the cities of the future can't be, for reasons of carbon neutrality alone, a house and a garden and a house and a garden and a park nearby. The cities of the future will have to be, if there's any inkling of meeting a 2 degrees Celsius rise versus pre-industrial times target, very, very dense. They will have to be probably denser than what you see here, which is Hong Kong. So primarily going to be composed of high rises. And their densification will be increased by indirect effects of climate change. So for example, as you know, the majority of humans live within 1 mile of the coast. Water levels are rising. This leads to a displacement of this group, and it leads to climate change-induced migration flows, which will often be within the country, into the city, and also between countries, and they will increase the densification. And I'm not going to take a deeper dive into this, but you probably know that the work on the impact of climate change and mental health shows that a lot of these things are going to be accelerated and exacerbated by this. So if you look at what the cities of the future will very likely be like, the question of how are people going to get the nature resilience that they deserve, that they have a right to in most formulations, how will that even be possible? It's not that trivial if you live in an urban situation such as this, and it becomes a pressing question of access equality also. So led by Greg Bradman again, who is now a professor on the West Coast, looking at this, group of scientists have proposed a systematic way in which we can bring the data that I've shown you on the effects of climate change on mental health by virtue of impacting urban ecosystems into a quantitative format that will allow it to be useful for city planning. And I was fortunate to have a research stay last year with a group of Gretchen Daly and the Natural Capital Project at Stanford. We were starting to bring this into software that can be used for urban planning, but also for carbon pricing, because you probably know that, you know, we have a good, pretty much universally agreed on model on the trajectory in which the Earth will warm. And then we have a range of very sophisticated models that cost the effects of this on aspects such as the economy, social, and also health. And the health model currently are very largely looking at somatic health, though, and they're not really considering the impact on mental health. And if you consider what I've shown you, that effect is very likely going to be quite considerable. So this way we're bringing it into the climate models in order to, for example, have a fairer carbon pricing, which is one of the consequences of that costing. With that, let me close. I've tried to show you, as I said, a few risk factors and then a few resilience factors, and trying to sort of show you this approach of combining environmental mapping, ecology, and neuroscience to try and understand the mechanism. I could have shown you other risk factors or other resilience factors. I've shown you two meta-analyses in which you can look them up if you want. It wasn't primarily about the specific factors, more about the general approach. I think that approach will be useful to us also as clinicians to better understand the risk and resilience landscape that we need to understand to treat people better and to be effective in prevention. With that, let me thank the funders of that work, our collaborators, and our lab that actually did that work. And let me thank you very much for your attention. And I'd be very happy to take a few questions if you're so inclined.